Hi, guys. So, as we talk about the different elements of the 1930s and the Great Depression, we've talked, about the economy, right? We also need to take a look at the culture and just what was going on at that time in the lives of people related to things other than just the economy and jobs and their homes that they lost. So, when you talk about the culture during this time, it's a very difficult time. It's very difficult, the lives of families and people. They were desperate for any sort of happiness, so they looked for different ways to kind of forget about their troubles, to take a break from everything that they're worrying about. So, once again, they went to different things related to the entertainment at the time: movies, watching sports, reading books, listening to music. These were all ways for people to have a release from their worries and just get away for a while and focus on some happiness. And so during this time, there was a lot of growth in the movie industry. Watching sports was more easily accessible. And once again, books were published. Music continued to be published and played. And the radio played a huge role in this. So when you think about the radio, it's very different back then than what it is now. When we turn on the radio, usually for the most part, we're just flipping through channels, listening to music stations, right? Occasionally, you might go to AM radio. There's more talk radio, there's sports radio. But really, during this time period, we think of this as basically a TV where there were different programs and people would act out plays and dramas. There would be mysteries. There'd be shows where people, whole families, would come together and gather around the radio and listen to different performances in addition to the music, of course. And so radio became a huge part of the lives of families in a way for them to come together and to bond. When you talk about the music, we talked about the jazz music that developed in the 1920s, and well, in the 1930s, jazz music continued, and it changed a little bit over time to where you have swing music or big band music. If you've ever seen swing dancing, you can look that up. It's really upbeat, fast music, and it's still with the brass and pianos and bass, where you have people listening to this type of music, and it became very popular. And Duke Ellington, he really led the way in this music in the 1930s. He was one of the most famous, very talented musicians at the time, because not only did he play piano, he composed and put together a lot of the music. He was a band leader, where he and his band traveled around not just the United States, but around the world, around Europe. So when we talk about discrimination, there were still places during this time in the United States where African Americans could not even enter in these clubs or these different places that they played at. So some of these venues, these music venues, they might bring in performers, African American performers, and so um, the African Americans, they might have to enter in the back of the building. They wouldn't be allowed to come in through the front, and they wouldn't really have been let in as paying customers. So there's still a lot of discrimination during this time. But Duke Ellington was able to with his bands become really quite famous despite that. And his music you can listen to and look up, but you could see there, he had these saxophones, trumpets. Here's some pictures here: saxophones, trumpets. Once again, he played the piano, and there was singing, right? Some singing, but this jazz music evolved into big band or swing music, is what it was called. Another important individual in the 1930s was Margaret Mitchell. She was the author of the book Gone with the Wind. Many people have likely heard of this book, partly too because she has a connection to Atlanta. If you've ever been to Atlanta before, she actually lived in Atlanta and she won the Pulitzer Prize, and that is the award for the highest award in literature. And the basically it was the best book the year that it was published, and it became extremely popular. But if you ever are in downtown Atlanta, you can actually go and visit Margaret Mitchell's house there, since it's now a memorial museum type of thing. And so she was really she was well known for this book. And what's interesting is that you can see this story here. um, it was released, right? And she was worried that the $3 price tag would make it so people could not afford or buy her book. Remember, a lot of people at this time did not have a lot of money at the time. And so this book is a large, thick book, long story. And despite the troubles of the Great Depression, it really did sell a lot, and it was able to spread and become a huge book with a huge following. And it also became a movie. You've probably seen or heard of the movie before as well. They filmed the movie, and in 1939 it came out. And so, like I said, many of you, if you've heard Gone with the Wind, probably you're more familiar with the movie. What's interesting is that in the year 1939, it became one of the great movies ever released. And at the same time, about 4 months apart, The Wizard of Oz was actually released also. So, those two movies, they kind of went back and forth as two of the best movies ever created, certainly at the time. And in the box office, the amount of people who watched it was just insane. But the novel itself is about the struggles that this character, Scarlett O'Hara, had in the South during the time of the Civil War. So in this book, it wasn't set during the time of the Great Depression, but instead during the Civil War. But despite that, people at this time could connect to that. They were experiencing tragedy and difficulties during the 1930s. And so the overall theme of overcoming tragedy and pain and desperation, that related to a lot of people during this time period, right? And so here is a scene from Gone with the Wind, and the movie, and it won 10 Academy Awards. And it says if you adjusted for inflation, meaning taking into account what the cost of what it was at the time of people paying these prices to see the movie, it's still one of the most successful films ever made, right? Now, we're going to look a little more closely at some of the culture that emerged during the New Deal and the Great Depression. Again, one of the things was movies. We saw movies during the 1920s sort of emerged and take hold of the American conscience. And during the Great Depression and the New Deal, they're going to provide temporary relief from the Depression. So just think about it. If you can escape into a dark theater, drift into the world of The Wizard of Oz and Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and just forget about your worries for a while. So that really drove movies to become very popular. A lot of people wanted to go see a movie. So you have The Wizard of Oz, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Frankenstein, all come out during the 1930s. And they were all sort of this mysticism, fairy tales that you could get lost in. You have Top Hat with the dancing and the singing, or Gone with the Wind, which was this, like I said, sort of this idealism of a time gone by. Then you have Frank Capra, who was a major director from this time period, whose films dealt with American idealism and triumph of the common man over adversity. His most famous was called Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, this film, which was about a young congressman who goes and sort of takes over Washington and brings that American idealism with him. And the radio was also an essential part of American culture. I've already mentioned it, and again, it was entertainment for the home and the family. It brought to life comedians like Bob Hope and Jack Benny, who you're definitely going to see take over a lot of media during World War II. You also have dramas like The Lone Ranger and The Shadow as well. The president will use the radio for fireside chats. But of course, the most famous moment in the radio in the 1930s, at least, was something called The War of the Worlds. This was Orson Welles' drama, where those who were listening at the beginning of The War of the Worlds, they knew this was just a story, that was a made-up story about an invasion, an alien invasion, right? But those who caught it midway, they had just tuned in like halfway through the story, they thought that there was a legit alien attack on the United States, and it produced panic across the country. And this incident led to a big discussion about the role of radio and about making sure that people knew that this wasn't the truth, right? This was just stories, kind of like fake news, right? People fell for it. We kind of have that today on the internet with like websites like The Onion and stuff, where they publish false headlines, and it can cause some people who are reading it to think this is actually like legit truth when it's really not. So even back then we had some of these problems. Once again, music is going to be very powerful during this time. We're gonna switch from jazz into swing music, which has got elements of jazz as well. You have Duke Ellington and his band with the song "It Don't Mean a Thing." If you ain't got that swing, right? I'm sure you've heard that song before. Um, and it's kind of moving into the big band era, which will of course have big influence within the 1940s. Your vocalist of the time period was Bing Crosby, and you also have Woody Guthrie, who will sing ballads about the Okies. Remember the people who are migrating, the Okies, people from Oklahoma who are migrating, especially to California because of the Dust Bowl. So Woody Guthrie, you probably know him best for the song "This Land Is Your Land," but he also sang about like the Dust Bowl saga and the Ballad of the Okie, which will really talk about bringing to light the Dust Bowl problems to the American public. When it came to art, art is very much influenced by the federal arts program. So you have the Federal Arts Project. We talked about the muralists, the artists during the Second New Deal, but you also have photographers like Dorothea Lange. And I have one of her most famous pictures here, which is the one of the migrant mother, the one on the left here. You also have the Federal Writers Project, who recorded history and folklore of the nation. One of the biggest, most powerful projects that they took on was the Slave Narrative Project. For this project, they went around basically and they interviewed all these former slaves and got their oral history and recorded it. And so, because of that, we have these recorded histories, these slave narratives before these people passed away, and we lost that time period forever, right? And then you have the Federal Theater Project, where playwrights they're basically going to write their plays and they're going to perform these strange performances for free to the American public. Now, when we look at literature, we have a number of books like The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck, which is about an Okie family who pushed out by the Dust Bowl, who goes to California looking for new opportunities, and they run into greed and corruption. You have Native Son by Richard Wright, which explores racial prejudice in the northern cities. You have playwrights like Lillian Hellman, who wrote strong roles for women during this time, or Clifford Odets, who focused on the working class in the Depression. And then you have the escapism of the comics. You have Flash Gordon, which was a scientific comic, or Dick Tracy, the detective story, if you've ever heard of any of these. And you also have the emergence of Superman, a superhero comic where you have Clark Kent, he basically can overcome it all and just be an average guy at the same time, who's secretly a superhero, right? Another big individual from this time period was Jesse Owens. So at the time, he was an African American track and field athlete. While he was in college, he became super well known because he began breaking world records, even as, a young athlete. And he eventually qualified to go to the Olympic Games. So in 1936, right before World War II really got started, Germany actually hosted the Olympics in Berlin. And so Adolf Hitler was already in charge at this time, and he really spread the message that he thought his athletes in Germany were superior to everybody else. They were racially superior, athletically superior, and certainly he believed that any African Americans would not be, nearly as talented. And so what ends up happening is that Hitler originally, at the beginning of the Olympics, was seen in the crowd everywhere, attending all these different ceremonies and watching these different events. But as Jesse Owens began to become more and more looked at as the best athlete at the time, he stopped showing up for the ceremonies of giving out the gold medal when Jesse Owens would win the gold medal. So Jesse Owens, he was actually in different track and field events like long jumps, sprinting, different types of races. Here's some pictures from the time. So he really was one of the fastest, greatest athletes of the time, and he won 4 gold medals. And really what's interesting is it really highlighted the fact that, once again, African Americans were just as skilled, just as talented as anybody else, if not more, in some cases. And so his success broke some of the stereotypes to where people were able to see this on a large stage because, the Olympics were looked at around the world. And so once again, Hitler did not like this with the way that he saw his race as superior. he we really see as we jump into as you're going to jump into World War II, you'll see he had some thoughts that were very dangerous, right? But Jesse Owens' success really kind of pushed back against those racial theories. So let me know. This is probably our last lesson here on the era of the 1930s, the Great Depression, the New Deal. So let me know if you have any questions, and I'll make sure to try to help you out.